Right, thank you all for coming along to this. And if anyone wants to say anything, please do interject. I'm going to be hopefully giving you some advice and wisdom and things I've learnt from students as much as anything about how you go through the exams. But obviously you guys, most of you have done a few exams and others might have heard other advice and wisdom about it. So yeah, so feel free to contribute anytime you want. But what I'm suggesting going through is 3 general areas of advice and help to get you through the exams. So one of those is the obvious one, is tips and tricks for actually going through the exam, completing it. Important thing, actually getting through the blasted thing. In some subjects that can be tricky, but also how to approach certain types of question, and some general rules for approaching a question you are not sure about, you're not sure you can actually achieve anything on. I'd also like to tell you what I feel I can about how the questions are written. Obviously, I've written, I think it's getting on for 400 questions now for EASA, and we write them under strict rules, and that's not really publicized, and we write them in certain ways that I think it's helpful if you know some of the background of how the questions are written, just because it helps you understand why certain right and wrong answers come up, and also helps you to ignore the extraneous material in the question. Some of it will be me complaining about how difficult it can be, because that's actually relevant, because some of the difficulties we face as question writers actually feed into how we write the question, and therefore what comes up in front of you. So obviously I can't tell you everything about it, but what I feel I can without breaking confidentiality with the EASA, I will talk about. And finally, I'll go briefly over some advice about revising before the exams, which will to a small degree depend on subject. It will vary slightly on subject, but also there'll be general advice that covers all the subjects. Okay, so let's start out. I will use a board, so obviously there's not a lot for me to write, but I'll write a few headings and so on. So we'll start out with in the exam. Okay, so in the exam itself, what's some bits of advice and hints I can give you? And probably the most important thing, even if it's only for a couple of subjects, is timing, okay, and time management. Now, there are a handful of subjects. Where some students do run out of time, but probably 95% of the times when I hear of a student running out of time, it's on one of 2 subjects: general navigation, DNAV, or flight planning. Yeah, and if any of you have done the exam, you really understand why. But you may well have come across problems with timing in these exams. Now, flight planning is somewhat obvious. You've got charts and graphs on there. Charts and graphs can take a long time, and you can get bogged down in them. GenNav, we also have charts, but we also have things like equipment, like flight computer. Now, I know some of you are Ostro Control and probably use electronic flight computer for that. I suspect that will significantly reduce the number of people running out of time, and I think that's actually more. I believe that's more unfair on the people who aren't allowed to use electronic than the accuracy and simplicity of using the, because it's relatively easy to learn to use the CRP5 or CR3, whatever mechanical flight computer you want to use. But I think the time is a big difference. So one of advice for Gen Nav is, if you are allowed to use electronic flight computer for time management, use an electronic flight computer. I don't actually particularly like them. I quite like the CRP5, but definitely for time management. Sorry, flight computer. So that gives us a hint about time management, which is that at some point we should perhaps focus on the chart questions and maybe on the flight computer questions for Gen Nav, and on the graph questions for flight planning, but also potentially for performance and even mass and balance if you feel you might run out of time on those. But also to note that we mustn't get bogged down on these questions. And if you feel it is going to take you too much time and you're confused by a graph or a chart, set that aside for the end. Now, I say set that aside for the end. In general, it's not such a bad idea to do these at the beginning. And in fact, this is something I did learn from a student, which actually seemed like a very good idea, and he found it worked very well for flight planning, was not only to do the charts and graphs at the beginning, but even before that, to do the type-in questions. Okay, so if you're doing the UK CAA exams or any other authority that uses type-in questions and drop-down menus, if you do the type-in questions first, one small advantage of that is that you can't really guess the type-in questions. So if you do come to the very end and you've got 5 minutes to answer the last 6 or 7 questions, which is obviously the worst case scenario, then at least with the multi-choice questions, you can make a guess. And if you do have 6 or 7, you can expect to get 1 or 2 of those right. And that might well be the difference between passing and failing. And now this student, actually what he did was the typing questions first, and then went on to the chart questions on flight planning. Now, the advantage of doing the chart questions first is that you then can sort of set aside the charts, and you don't need to go back into the Jepson for the flight planning or the couple of I think there's only one chart now you need to use for Gen Nav, isn't it? It's more important for flight planning. On the subject of charts, so do the charts early on the flight planning, particularly get them out of the way. I believe they are not necessarily in sequence, so it's not necessarily a bunch of chart questions together. So you might have to search through the exam for the chart questions and then go back to the other questions. But what you're going to be able to do then is more easily find the charts you want, because you're getting into the swing of chart questions, and you'll get into the pace of looking for laps and longs as well. So the other thing I would suggest before you do any Gen Nav or flight planning exam is to make sure you're quick at finding the latitudes and longitudes on the chart. Okay, so that's another part of why I would say do all the chart questions together, probably at the beginning. You get into the swing of looking for lats and longs, and with the current charts, the easiest way of doing that is to look for an almost blank area of chart. It's really hard to find the lats and longs where you're in a really busy area of the chart with a lot of airways, navigation aids, airports, and so on. So find an almost blank area of the chart and then just count, because you've got lines every 1 degree. So just count east or west to find the corner you want. So if you're trying to find, let's say 49 degrees north, 011 degrees east, then look in a blank area, and maybe the blank area you'll find 50 degrees north, 007 degrees east. So what you want to do is you want to go 1 down, and that's 49 north, and then you go 4 across, 4 to the right, and you'll come to 11 east, and then you'll probably find the lat and long mark there, exactly there, and confirm it. And so that's on the new charts, on the current charts for Jepson. That's the best way I've found for finding the lats and longs. Practice that. That's one good use, by the way, on the revision side of it. One really good use for the exam databases. Sadly, at the moment there aren't that many questions on flight planning, but happily that means you probably won't see many that you don't, that you're not used to, that you're not familiar with when you get to the real exam. Okay, so that's a bit about time planning, time management. So type in first, and that applies to any exam with numerical answers. Is look for if you're likely to be, or if you feel you might be pressured for time, go for typing first. And to be honest, if you're not going to be pressured for time, don't worry about it. But if you feel you're going to be pressured for time, which you probably will be on these two subjects, go for the typing first. And of course, both of these have type-in answers. Right. You might find it's less important, but I have known students to run out of time in meteorology as well. So you might find, again, you want to do all the chart questions together, the type in first, and maybe then go to the chart questions. Yeah, so using the charts and graphs from the Met information section. Okay, so that's that. What about questions you're not really sure of at all? Someone mentions running out of time in maths and balance. Yes, people sometimes do run out of time in maths and balance. Now, again, that's a subject with typing questions and graphs. What tends to happen in maths and balance is you've got a few large questions. Typically, it's only 25 questions, and some of them are 3 markers, which will be 3-minute questions. Now, new questions should be better, but some of the old questions, which are still in the question bank, 3-minute questions might take you more than 3 minutes. And it's easy, particularly if you're not as familiar as you should be with a graph. And there are definitely, certainly, I can say this for a fact for the helicopter guys, and it's probably the case for the airplane guys as well. There are some graphs you won't be familiar with, or diagrams you won't be familiar with, which are not from CAP 696 or CAP 758. I can definitely say there are some charts in there that aren't in CAP 758. So if you come across something unfamiliar and you're not sure how to read it, I would say leave it to the end. Because yes, it might be a big question. We don't really want to, obviously, you could lose nearly 10% if you fail to answer a 3-mark question. So we don't want to leave it, but you also don't want to get bogged down on it and run out of time because you bogged down on one question. So if you do find yourself getting stuck in a question, leave it till the end. Yeah. Okay. So there are some of the calculations that people do get bogged down in, but if you are finding that, so particularly in maths and balance, ask me, because I do know some easy ways of doing some things. Right. Yeah, someone suggests in Gen Nav, any merit in skip reading the whole exam, answering the very quick minimal calculations first, just in case the last few questions are easy ones that don't end up getting to. That's almost the opposite technique, but that is another technique, is to go through the simple 1-word answer questions first, which you don't have to do much calculation for. I'm almost tempted to say with Gen Nav, just because I know how the exam tends to be structured, have a glance at the last couple of questions. Now, what I found is that a few students have come to the last few questions, last 2 questions usually, and run out of time because the last 2 questions were beta, gamma, delta type questions. So the flight log, the operational flight plan questions, which students tend to take too much time on, and I can understand why. I can understand why people take too much time on them, because they're not like a real operational flight plan. When I have written questions with an operational flight plan, which I have for flight planning and for Gen Nav, I've always done a real one, or something that looks very like a real one. because I think that's easier for the students to understand and find the information they need. Whereas those alpha, beta, gamma ones, which are a tiny subsection of a operational flight plan that's not realistic to the ones you're used to, I don't like those. I think they take longer than they should. And so people run out of time in the last couple of questions, and I think they're 2 markers as well, in general. So it might be worth looking at the last couple of questions and seeing if they're long questions that you think are 2 markers, and maybe answering those. But I would say a lot of people, and Rob has just mentioned that he did charts and then CRP5, and to a degree they're the long questions on GenNav. And most of what I found is that students who've done the long questions first and then done the short questions have done well. And I think what happens is that you get used to the pattern of going through the charts, then the pattern of the CRP5, and your mind is in that mindset, because everyone knows that it takes a few seconds to get into the swing of a type of question. And so if you're going over fairly similar questions in a row, getting them over with, I think you get through them quickly. And in fact, I remember my experience of the flight planning exam. This was back when it was a 3-hour exam, and it was a lot more questions, so people were complaining about or not finishing that often. And I actually finished with time to spare. And what I remember was that the pattern that happened to come up, I didn't consciously choose it. I didn't have any real plan. But the pattern that happened to come up was all the long questions came up first. I actually remember being halfway through the questions in terms of number of questions. In terms of question numbers, I was halfway through, checked the time, and I was actually at the 1.5 hour mark, i.e. halfway through the question. I thought, right, I'm on speed here. I can finish this exam, no problem. And then I think it was only something like half an hour later I'd finished the exam, because maybe a bit longer than that, probably a bit longer than that, but 40 minutes, maybe 45 minutes later I'd finished the exam, because at that halfway mark I'd done most of the long questions as it happened to fall in that exam, and that worked out really well for me. So I would say, as a rule, most people seem to work best if they do the longer questions first, and gathering particularly the chart questions. Let's think. Yeah, what I would suggest though is that you do some timed exams before you get to the real exam. I think all the question banks will give you a timed exam with the same number of questions as the real exam, and try both techniques and see which seems. Time yourself, but more give yourself what impression of how quickly you think you're doing it, because obviously each one might have more or fewer chart questions, for example. So give yourself an impression of whether it's better to do the short snappy question. To be honest, the other thing that happens, if you do the short snappy question first, then you get all the chart questions together. They're just at the end, and that's fine as well, I suppose, because again you're getting into the pattern of doing chart questions. And also you might find in by your personality, the fact that you've actually got a load of questions out of the way that were fairly quick, easy, straightforward, minimal calculations, as you say, so no calculation questions. That might be something you prefer. So it could work for you. One thing I would definitely say is gather those chart questions together, or a particular type of calculation, if you're particularly if it's one you don't like. Yeah. So for example, going back to mass and balance, if it's moving mass questions, if anyone has problems with those, by the way, and hasn't seen my lessons, I've just done a revision lesson this morning and we did moving mass. But so that's a classic example, the moving mass questions in mass and balance. Gather them all together, go through all of them. If that's something that you really don't like, go through all of them together and you get used to them. Adding a buffer when doing the practice exams. That again might be somewhat to do with personality, but yeah, some people. I do know a lot of people. A lot of people do like to, or do like to add in to assume they're going to take longer in the real exam. Now, I do find some people, because of the stress of the exam, actually focus more. Now I know, right, silly mistakes. Something about silly mistakes. In your practice, you will make silly mistakes, and you'll forget to do a bit of the calculation that you really should have done. Now, what I find with most people is that they make fewer of those in the real exam. There are exceptions, though. So people who have a problem with exams, who get particularly stressed in exams. I've known a couple of students who were perfectly good on practicing the question. Yeah, that Daniel says RTFQ. So reading the full question, that's what that means, of course. That's a classic error that people will make, and they make it less. They generally make it less often in the exam, but they still do make that in the exam. So do be careful of it still. But if you are the personality that gets overstressed by exams, try and work out techniques to deal with stress. I'm not a stress management expert. I do have some techniques. I'm not going to put them here, but if anyone wants to know some little techniques for calming in exams, I do know one or two. So just let me know. Yeah, find yourself a technique to relax in the exam, and be aware that if you are that personality, you probably will make a few more silly errors in the exam. So give yourself a bit more of a buffer. Make sure you're getting really good marks before you go into the exam. Because I've had students who were getting in the 80s on practice plenty of times, but with the stress of the exam, they were then sort of slightly failing the exam. So I had to sort of get them up more into the 90s, knowing that these particular personalities just didn't like exams. I mean, it tends to happen particularly to people who've dropped out of school relatively early, and so haven't done many exams, but maybe even haven't done any public exams, sort of, official exams, only ever done school exams, and yeah, so they get even more stressed by exams. Okay, so there's that. Right. So what about questions that you don't know the answer to? There's always going to, whatever happens, there's always going to be questions you don't know the answer to. And then we get down to elimination. Okay. And elimination, elimination is as good as finding the right answer if you can eliminate 3 of the answers. Okay, so if you, and there are some questions where that is the best technique. Actually, flight planning is a classic example of that. So you've all seen the questions where it gives you a start point and an end point of a route, and it asks you which airways you should fly, which routing. It gives you an ATS flight plan format routing. Excuse me, we're flying down different airways. The easiest way of answering those questions by far is to find why 3 of them are wrong, because you know 3 of those answers are wrong. And it's very easy to miss why an answer is wrong. So you could come up with an answer and you think, oh, that one looks right, but you've missed the fact that actually it's got an airway there to, I'll do a reporting point, I don't want to bother with the waypoint. Yeah, so there's an airway through that reporting point, and this airway actually slightly misses the reporting point. It doesn't actually, you know, you can't actually change it. It's probably not SATCO, but so if this is the Alpha 39er and this is the Bravo 12, you can't fly Bravo 12 to SATCO, then Alpha 39 to whatever, because they miss. Yeah, I mean, they in some cases they will show jumping over, but and sometimes that's even, there is at least one question where you can only really see that fact on an expansion of the detail. They've actually got a note on the main chart, but it's such a crowded area you can't really see what's happening. So they do a note with a sort of 1 there or something, and then there's 1, and it gives a clearer diagram of that small part. So you have to look at all those. So really, realistically, the best way of answering those questions is eliminating 3 answers. But it's actually very commonly a good technique. So, for example, with a a question which has a list of answers, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and you've got to work out which of, you know, whether 1 and 2 are correct, 3 and 4, or 1, 3, and 4. You can usually eliminate at least 2 answers just by knowing one of them's wrong. Yeah. So and by knowing 2 of those, you might be able to eliminate 3 answers, in which case you found the correct answer. Yeah. So I can't give every example where this is the best technique, but always be aware. This is, I mean, most of you have heard me say this this before, but do be aware in the back of your mind that some questions are better answered by elimination, so that you can then recognize them, because mostly it is fairly obvious when you think about it, like that routine question. To me, it's fairly obvious that the best thing to do is eliminate the 3 answers that must clearly be wrong. There's another classic in meteorology, where it shows 4 diagrams of a front with the isobars crossing it, and the one A looks like this, B looks like this, C looks like this, and D looks like this. Now I can immediately eliminate 2 answers because they don't look like anything we've seen before in any diagram. Okay, that's not what fronts look like. They're never that much of a change in direction of the isobar at the front, and they never go that way. Okay, this is Northern Hemisphere, by the way. So we can immediately eliminate 2 of those answers. Yeah, and the other one, you eliminate this one by saying it's going to be less active. So you start having to think about these 2, and you know, either these 2 look possible. These 2 you can definitely eliminate, and that brings us to eliminating 2 answers. Now, there's 2 advantages to eliminating 2 answers. 3 advantages. One, it might highlight what's important. So you might only have one small difference between the remaining 2 answers, and so you can really focus on what's important, forgetting about anything relating to the 2 answers you've eliminated. Secondly, it's quicker. You've now only got 2 answers to look through. If you can quickly eliminate 2 answers, you've only got to think in any detail about 2 answers, and it's very common that you can quickly eliminate 2 answers. We'll talk about why when I talk about how the questions are written. The third is that even if you then can't eliminate any more or decide between the final 2, you've then got a 50-50 chance. Now, I don't know how good my advice is, but I always give this advice, and I think it's right. If you do end up in that position where you can't decide between 2 answers, but you manage to eliminate 2, toss a coin. Now, you're probably not allowed a coin in an exam anymore, so I would use the random number generator on your calculator, and if the first figure after the decimal is 0 or even, then it's the first answer. If it's odd, then it's the second answer. That's a good 2-way choice. Now, the reason I say that is because if you yeah, 2 longest answer. I'll talk about the longest answer actually. Right. So what was I saying? Yeah. So if you are down to 2 answers and you don't know the answer, and you actually try and think, and you know you don't know the answer, and you try and think too much, there is, and you don't have any really solid basis for that thought, there is a really good chance you will fall into a trap. Yeah, I think. Okay, so there's a really good chance you'll fall into a trap. And so I say, unless you have a good reason for answering between the 2, then try random numbers. Now, don't forget, if you can get 60% of the answers, which mostly you can, and then you can eliminate 2 answers for the rest, which again often will be the case. Almost everything you can eliminate at least 1 answer, but often you'll find that all the rest of the answers, you can eliminate two, all the rest of the question, you can eliminate 2 answers. And then you can, so you're down to 50-50, then you should expect to get about 80% in the exam. So it could easily be that you pass on that basis. Yeah. Now that falling into traps thing. So on the subject of falling into traps, that brings me neatly, segueing on to the next thing, is don't change your answer. Don't change. Now, of course, there are exceptions to this. But the only exception should be where you know what silly error you made, you can articulate why the answer you foolishly already put down is wrong. So I fell into that trap. I forgot to do that calculation, or I did that or I did that bit of calculation when I shouldn't have done because it's not that question. Yes. Or if you can say, oh, damn, no, that was X, whereas actually I'm being asked about Y, and it's that fact. So if you can articulate what trap you fell into, what calculation error you made, or what calculation you forgot to do, or what extraneous calculation you did which wasn't needed because they were already asking for true and you've done magnetic, or they were asking for 2 and you've done the reciprocal and didn't need to, for example. So if you can articulate what you did wrong, then change the answer. But if you can't, if you're just thinking, oh, I don't really think it was that answer, maybe I think actually I'm persuaded now it was this one, then don't, just leave the original answer. So often I've talked to students who've got 72% because they changed a couple of answers, and they changed it from the correct answer to the wrong answer. Yeah. Okay, so Dan's just asking, Met should use 1 hectopascal as 30 or 27 feet. It should be 27 feet for Met, 30 for everything else. Now, I can't speak for everyone else, but when I write questions, I always put which I'm using. Yeah, and yeah, those of you that have got my random question sheet, I've got if anyone needs one, if anyone needs to do Met flight planning or GenNav practice altimetry questions, let me know. I've got a spreadsheet that will give you random questions of that, and it will use either 30 or 27 feet per hectopascal, depending on what you ask. Yeah, just email me if you want that. Just drop me a quick email to ask me, so otherwise I'll forget. Okay. In fact, I'll probably put it up on the Facebook thing. It's probably a good idea, isn't it? Yeah. So don't change answers. Right. And you've probably been told this by an instructor before, but that's actually the elimination and the don't change answers are the biggest thing to learn about exam techniques, I think. Okay. Plus, I suppose time management. But time management is, to some degree, as we've really found, is somewhat personal, but I've been able to give some generalized advice. A few slightly more specific ones. With your calculator, by the way, something I'll say it on this video, so I don't have to say it to every student. If you've got a Casio calculator and you haven't done it yet, press Shift Mode 1, 2. It's actually Shift Setup 1, 2. Because if your calculator is coming out with answers in fractions, it's only a tiny time to then turn it into a decimal, but it's slightly annoying, and it feels like you're taking too much time. It will come up with decimals instead of fractions. Yeah, so press Shift Mode 1, 2, and you won't have to press the SD button to change it into decimals in the future. One small point about questions that are particularly common in Principles of Flight, but also come up in others, where you have correct, incorrect type questions. There's a few others that are similar, but it's where it's easy to get the logic the wrong way around. Yeah. Now, for a start, if they've negated anything, by the way, not should be put in capital letters. When we're writing the questions, we have to put, anytime we say not, is not X. Yeah, the thing we're asking you about is not getting larger or is not going to change, for example. We have to put not in capitals. So that's one thing of the logic. But be really, really, the main thing I would say in the exam is be really, really careful of the way around everything is being asked, because most of these questions, part of the reason I'm sure that they've introduced so many of these questions is that they're very difficult to remember the answer. So people learning the exams, the EASA are trying to stop people learning the question banks, and people learning the question banks have great difficulty learning these. And as Dan said, same applies to Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere questions. I'm going to mention that on the revision, but actually, a lot of the time, Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere questions, they're just the opposite, but you've just got to be very careful, particularly when they say Southern Hemisphere, because probably 3/4 of the questions are Northern Hemisphere. Poor Dan comes from South Africa, so he has to remember that most of the questions are going to be in the Northern Hemisphere, but be careful about that. Now, the correct, incorrect thing, be really careful of the logic being the right way around. Things like, the classic would be ground effect. They mostly ask you about leaving ground effect. This also applies to both airplanes and helicopters. What happens when you leave ground effect? Now, of course, what we tend to learn is what happens when we enter ground effect. So be really cautious about that one. So be cautious about knots, but they should be in capital letters whenever it's put there. And the other thing is, while you're revising, we're not talking about revision yet, but we'll say it on the revision side, learn when things, actually that's a good point, thanks Jordan. Learn when things go together. So the classic is when they talk about Mach number and drag divergence, sorry, Mach crit, critical Mach number, and drag divergence Mach number. So if M crit goes up, then critical drag rise Mach number or drag divergence Mach number must go up, always. So what can happen is that in the question they say X happens, the aircraft's heavier, let's say, or the aircraft maneuvers, and then they say M crit increases is statement 1, and statement 2 is MCDR decreases. And you then must know that one of those is right and one of them's wrong, assuming the question statement actually changes them. In theory, they could do something where it doesn't change, in which case, but I don't think they will. But in which case, of course, they could both be wrong. But assuming whatever puts in this question statement does change Mach crit, then MCDR goes in the same direction. And so you you immediately eliminate 2 answers. Because one answer will be correct, one answer will be incorrect, and you know those are wrong, because you know these can't both be correct and they can't both be incorrect. You know one of them must be right and one of them must be wrong. Likewise, I mean, there's probably also a question that is identical except that it says both increase. Now, in this case, they must either both be correct. Whatever the question statement, they must either both be correct or both be incorrect. Yeah. That, because they go together, you can now eliminate 2 answers. That's really nice, because remember we said if you can eliminate 2 answers, you can then focus on what you've got, and then you really only need to be honest. Once you've eliminated 2 answers, you only need to know what that does, and then you've eliminated a 3rd answer, haven't you? Yeah. Okay. Something that Jordan brought up, which is really specific to a certain range of questions, but actually the thought processes apply to a lot. Threshold and 50 feet. Yeah, typically 50 feet. Yes, I know for performance class airplanes, or is it all helicopters for takeoff? The screen height is 35 feet, or is it just performance class 1 helicopter, 1 and 2 helicopters? I can't remember, but anyway, on a takeoff, on a departure, you might have 35 feet. But typically for the questions we're talking about, which could be in performance, I've seen them in performance and gen nav, where you're talking about heights above an aerodrome datum, you have to remember the shift by 50 feet. So this is very specific, and you must always remember that you are over the landing threshold on an approach, you're expecting to be over the landing threshold at 50 feet, and on a departure, you're expecting to be over the upwind at the end of the takeoff distance required, or takeoff distance required helicopter. You're ending up at 35 feet for a helicopter or Class A aircraft, or 50 feet for a Class B aircraft, airplane. Sorry, for a Class B airplane at 50 feet. And so that's got to be applied to any further calculations you do. Now, obviously, that's very specific to those types of questions, but it's a general rule. These little adjustments, these small bits of knowledge that are important, be really careful of them. They're classic errors people make. And this is what I meant when I said most people make fewer of these errors in the exam. But if your revision hasn't gone right and highlighted the fact that this is necessary, then of course you will still make a mistake because you don't know. And this is another advantage of the question banks, is that it will highlight little problems like this if you've forgotten them, because this is the sort of thing you will go through in the course and think, yeah, that's great, and then you come to the end and revising and you've completely forgotten it, and it's so easy to forget. I would suggest in your we're coming into revision now, really. In your revision, write these things down. Yeah, make sure these things are prominently written with their own little block in your summary sheets. Because my first thing, actually, that's lovely. I'm getting some lovely segues here. Thank you, guys. Because that segues us neatly into revision. So change of topic up here. Revision. This is exactly the sort of thing. This is exactly the sort of thing people don't think to put in their revision summary sheet, but actually should be in there. Now, you tend to remember things like factors. Let's say for performance, everyone remembers to put the performance factors in, and things like how to work out your obstacle domain. But a little fact like this, it's not so much the fact. No one forgets this fact, really. Except I've forgotten whether Class 3 helicopters are 35 feet or not on departure. But what they do is they forget to apply it. And so it should be in your summary sheet, not because I expect you to forget it, but because I expect you, and you will do it. You're guaranteed to do it at some time during your either your revision or in the exam itself. So let's do it in your revision instead. And again, that's why doing a lot of questions is useful. You will forget it. Okay, so put it prominently in your summary sheet, and it should be your summary sheet. I see a lot of people asking on the WhatsApp group text or on the Facebook group about summary sheets for different subjects, particularly I can see why, for performance particularly. To be honest, I always have to have some form of reference when I'm teaching performance. Now, when they're open for face-to-face business, I teach performance for Cat 3C at the moment, and I need them. I need in front of me, because otherwise I forget to list them all. I know what the factors are, but I forget to list them all. There's so many niggly little factors, and this has to be bigger than this. This can't be less than this, etc. That you've got to have some form of summary sheet, and it's much easier if you get it from someone else. But what I would suggest is you write your own summary sheet. Now, there's no problem with you taking someone else's summary sheet and making it your own, writing your own from that. In fact, that's a really good idea, because it means you won't forget anything. Because if you take a really old one that's been several generations of students have had it, which I'm sure there are some out there, then if something was forgotten in the first place, then a later student would have said, actually, you need that there as well. But I would say write it for yourself. It will get it in an order that makes sense to you, and you'll think about the order, and you'll think about the connections. Things like, I'll stick to performance, and sorry, helicopter chaps, I'll stick to aeroplane performance because there's some really good examples. The V2 must be greater than or equal to 1.1 VNCA, and it must be greater than or equal to 1.13 BSR1. Whereas for, this is Class A, the Class B, all engines operating 4%, climb gradient requirement, it must be at a speed which I teach as VTOS. It's not in the syllabus, so don't necessarily learn that, but this is sort of a takeoff safety speed. We must assume a speed that's greater than or equal to 1.1 VMCA and greater than or equal to 1.2 VS1. Yeah. And now there's obvious connections here for a start. If you learn these both together, you can see, well, it's only both of them are 1.1 VMCA. There you go, that's great. Both of them are actually the speed you expect to achieve at screen height, at least dry. Yeah, we know Class A screen height wet, one engine operative is only 15 feet, and this is the 35-foot speed. This is a 35-foot speed, so this is, I'll say 35 foot, and this calculation is usually done, is actually, it doesn't actually say, does it say, I can't think whether it says or not. I don't think it says in the regulations, but this is the speed you're expected to achieve by 50 foot on a Class B, and it's useful to remember that as a minimum. But so they're both kind of a takeoff safety speed, but these look different. But actually, if you calculate it, helicopter guys don't worry about this calculation, but the airplane guys should know this. If we multiply 1.13 by 1.06 to turn it from a reference stall speed into a stall speed, I get 1.2. So these are actually the same speed. This and this are both 1.2 times VS1. This is just expressed as it is in CS25. This is CS25, and this is CS23, which is slightly awkward because there are some Class A aircraft in CS23, but under CS23. Yes, yes, there are. Because we all know that everyone knows that CS25 is from £19,000, whereas CS23, sorry, whereas Performance Class A is from £12,500. Yeah, 5,700 kilos. So there, very awkward. But anyway, it's the point I'm making is that when you make your own reference sheet, you can match these together and put some link to say, look, these are actually the same things. When you're having to learn these figures, there's some coherence and there's some logic to them. It's not just a random bunch of numbers. And particularly, I mean, that's a particular one where it is 1.13, or there's something that's 1.08. There's another that's 1.23. And if we multiply each of these by 1.06, it makes a much more coherent figure. This is 1.2, this is 1.15, and this is 1.3. And the reason is these are all reference stall speeds. These are all multiples of reference stall speeds, which gives these as a multiple of a stall speed. And so if you notice that coherent pattern, it's much easier to remember these. Yeah, it's much easier to remember these numbers if you notice that actually converted from a reference stall speed to a stall speed, the factors are actually these. Yeah, and that's what comes out if you make, that's the sort of thing that comes out if you make your own summary sheet rather than just using someone else's and trying to learn what they've written. So that's the most important thing. Secondly, of course, while you're making up your own sheet and looking for those connections, you're learning. Yeah, that then sets much more in your head than just through reading through it. Yeah. Any questions on summary sheets? Anyway, I don't tend to have that. Well, by the way, that's one of the reasons I don't tend to give out summary sheets. I don't actually have any because I would like my students to write their own. As I say, if you get one from somewhere else, that's fine. They're available all over the internet. You can get them on the forums if you want them. But yeah, write your own. Mnemonics. Use mnemonics as much as you can. Make up your own mnemonics. I remember I made up a ridiculous one for the 18 annexes. There are 19 now, but the 18 annexes for air law, and I can still remember that mnemonic. It was stupid, and I could still list the annexes in order from my own stupid made up mnemonics. Actually, it was about 4 different mnemonics, but there you go. So if you don't have mnemonics, make them up. I've got a few mnemonics that if there's something that needs a mnemonic and you don't know one, I'll ask. I might have a mnemonic, so just ask on the forum, on the page or something. And yeah, notice with a lot of mnemonics, there is a lot of opposites. So classic, let's say the gyro apparent drift is my favorite example of this. Is that you've got Earth rate, you've got latitude nut, and you've got transport east, and you've got transport west. And if you do them in that order, noticing that the Earth spins eastward, so Earth rate is equivalent to transport east, hence we put transport east first. And then we get northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere. All I need to remember is one of these. Okay, I always remember that Earth rate in the northern hemisphere is a negative error. And then I just fill out every time anything changes, it reverses. And that's my pattern of errors. How quick was that? And my mnemonic was based on the fact that the lat nut has to be opposite to Earth rate to cancel out Earth rate. And transport west is going to be opposite to transport east, whereas transport east is equivalent to Earth rate because they're both moving east. And southern hemisphere is going to be the reverse of the northern hemisphere. That's an absolute classic. There's plenty of times when I think Dan mentioned UNOS and ONUS, undershoot north, overshoot south in the northern hemisphere, but of course overshoot north and undershoot south in the southern hemisphere. You've got sand and ends, so accelerate north, decelerate south, but that goes to the south, you accelerate north, you decelerate if, in the southern hemisphere. So you can revert, but you can remember that you only need to remember one of the mnemonics, in fact. And you just then remember that the other hemisphere is in reverse. Yeah, so that's a way to remember mnemonics better. I find a lot of students struggle with, actually, because there's a hell of a lot of mnemonics you have to know. And you know, I've made up two mnemonics. PIT, PT for altitude, altimetry. If no one's seen it, ask me about it. I've tried to put that out a bit. That's one of the mnemonics I made up, and VCR for bearing conversions. So that's variation, convergence, and convergence or conversion angle and reciprocal. So that's reminding. It's not just variation really. It's reminding you have to get it in the right reference. You have to get it off the right meridian, and you might need to take the reciprocal. So anytime you're converting bearings from one bearing to another, particularly on a great circle, then this mnemonic will make sure you don't forget any process of it. So I've made up two mnemonics that people find helpful. How many mnemonics are there in 14 exams? I don't know. If anyone wants to know how to use my mnemonics, let me know. But they're very, very useful. But if I can teach you just to use sort of a tiny mini mnemonic, just as I say, using onus in the northern hemisphere and just remembering that all you need to do for the southern hemisphere is reverse it, that makes it slightly simpler. Yeah. Sorry, UNOS in the northern hemisphere, isn't it? Onus in the southern hemisphere, UNOS in the northern hemisphere. Then you just need to reverse it to the southern hemisphere. You don't need to remember the two separate mnemonics. Yeah. Okay, so that's it for mnemonics. Exam databases, use of databases. I've mentioned this once or twice already. Right, so the EASA are trying to stop you using the databases. They're going to be claiming copyright soon. As soon as the new question bank comes in, they're claiming copyright on that, and so the question banks will have to slightly change, so they're not using exact questions. However, to me, that shouldn't be a big problem for most subjects, because the reason I think the question banks are useful for, I would say for 10 out of the 14 subjects, maybe 8, but certainly 8 of the question. 8 subjects, it's far more useful for you to test your knowledge and direct your revision than it is for you to learn the questions. I know, and I'm not an idiot. I know that there are subjects where it is better to just learn the questions. And I had a student who had flown Navajos, Learjets, A320s, and 787s, and he was doing a license conversion, and he failed IFR comms. Yeah. The reason was, of course, that IFR comms has some really, really old questions and is nothing like real radio use. So there are subjects like that where you just have to learn the questions. When I sat air law, admittedly, this was the only exam I failed. I had the question, if the nation wished to leave the Tokyo Convention, who must be informed? And I think I got it wrong, and I got 73%, so it still annoys me to this day. Because that's a stupid question. It's the stupidest question I've ever seen in any exam ever. And, you know, I can't understand why that question was ever written. But the reason I mention it here, apart from air law, I would say the two comms and ops procedures to some degree. Even then, on some of ops procedures, you can't really do that. But that's what I would say. Yeah, I know a lot do it on human performance, but I would say human performance, direct your revision with the question bank rather than learning the questions, because that, to be honest, I think because it's easier. Human performance and instruments, by the way, I tend to put together. You mentioned radio nav. Yeah, radio nav. To be honest, to me, radio nav is very easy to understand. Admittedly, I know I did physics at university to some degree, so that does help. And obviously, I've used all the instruments and I've heard of it. But so I think it's much more of an understandable subject. And also, recently, I believe there've been a lot of new questions, so you might find that there's a sort of big change there. Of course, there's an injection of a load of PBN stuff, and I imagine there's a lot of new PBN just because it is a relatively new section of the course, and a lot of it is PBN. There's a lot of new GNSS questions, partly because, of course, new GNSS systems are coming in on stream. So Galileo, the Galileo actual learning objectives are relatively recent. For a while, there was just a holding place there with a tiny amount about to Galileo, but a load of learning objectives that just said sort of for future reference for Galileo. So I think there's a lot of new GNSS and PBN questions coming in, and they are the big sections. GNSS is the biggest section of RNAV, from what all the students tell me, that's the biggest section of questions, is GPS and GLONASS, etc. Right, where were we? Yeah, so learning question bank. So as what I was saying about the law thing, about that question I had, what that says to me is that someone's just gone through all the conventions and all the annexes and Doc 8168 and Doc 4444 and what's the other one? I can't remember. Anyway, the PANS documents, procedures for air navigation services, and just found whatever they wanted to ask about, and literally just gone through all the paragraphs of that and said, oh yeah, I'll ask that. And therefore, if you wanted to learn all those enough to not use the question bank, it would take 6 months just to learn air law, and then you'd probably struggle to pass. And it'd be ridiculous. So you've got to use the question bank. My excuse for failing was there were no question banks when I took it. So I've no idea how I passed in the end, because I can't understand how anyone can pass that without a question bank. And I got 77%, and I admit they corrected 6 of the questions, I believe, because they were wrong. So I might actually have failed, but because some of the questions were wrong, I passed. But it was a ridiculous exam. So yeah, I'm realistic. So both comms, air law. Yeah, so I'll talk to you about that later, Dan. Actually, that's a big subject. But anyway, yeah. So how do we use the question banks then? So for the other subject, how do we use the question banks? My suggestion, this isn't strict, but my suggestion would be that you read through your notes. So I'm talking distance learning here. So if anyone's on a full-time course, obviously you'll do a similar process, but going through it in class, you'll be taken through it. But so go through chapter by chapter, and at the end of every chapter in your notes, do the chapter questions. They are useful. They're not as close to exam questions as the question banks, but actually they're not far off, and often a proportion of them are actual exam questions. So do the end of chapter questions, which obviously in a lot of distance learning courses that's online, and you have to do it to keep up your progress statements, which obviously have to be done before your final exam. So do your progress, then do your progress tests where those come up, which you definitely have to do because they're a requirement before you do your exams. By the way, do make sure you've done those before your exams. There have been talk now of students having lost their exam passes because it turned out they hadn't finished all their progress tests before they took the exam. Yeah, because once the schools enrolled you on the CAA website, you can book your own exams. So before, the schools would book your exams, they wouldn't book until you finish your progress test. But now, because you can book your own exams, don't do it until you finish your progress test. You don't want to pass it and then lose the pass. Okay, so, and then either at the end of the subject or at the end of each topic, I would then say go and do some question bank. 2 or 3, maybe even more, blocks of questions, either on that topic, if you're just doing it topic by topic, or on the whole subject, if you're doing it at the end. And note down, take particular note of the subject areas you're getting wrong, but also the ones you're getting wrong most often. Look at the explanations on the questions. They're, even on AvExam, which has the fullest explanations, they're rarely enough to completely show you around the subject. So what you want to be doing is noting that down, probably just on a piece of paper. Write down what subject area you got the question wrong, particularly if you've got more than one question wrong, and go back and revise that, and revise around it. And that, directing your revision, what you're doing there is you're doing 2 things. You're directing your revision and you're starting to learn what type of questions should come up. Yeah, so you're learning where to focus, both from the point of view of what you're getting wrong and from the point of view of what's coming up. Yeah, because you want to do much more focus of your studies on what's coming up in the exam than what's not. You know, it's realistically, I've already said for air law, but actually it applies to a lesser degree to every other subject. If you learn everything about every learning objective, it would take you years to do this damn thing. So you do need, I'm just being realistic, you do need to focus on the areas that are coming up in the exam. Even when we're not learning the question, we're focusing on those areas. So you do need to do that, but also you need to focus on the areas where you're weaker. And the question banks should help you do both. And that's the best usage of the question banks, to my mind. People often ask me, how do we use the question bank? What's the advantage of the question banks? Yes, you'll find you learn some questions. And even in GenNav, actually, yeah, they're both still in there. There's 2 questions I tell everyone to just learn in GenNav. Yeah, and the answers are 60 degrees and 6 minutes north or south. This is a question where you're asked for you're flying an INS route between 60 north 30 west, 60 north 20 west, and it asks you what your latitude at 60 north 25 west. I presume some of you have probably come across this question. It's a ridiculous question. The way of working it out is relatively long-winded, and it's absolutely no use for you except answering this question, which by the question banks, there might be 2 versions of it, but the answers, give or take north or south, the answer's the same. Yeah, one of them's in north, one of them's in south, the answer's the same. Yeah. And it's easy to remember because it's 6006. The other one's easy to remember as well because it's 80 degrees north, 80 degrees east. And this is the question where you're given half a polar stereographic chart. So it's a semicircle on the right. The chart looks sort of like let's just delete half of that. Oh no, I don't want that. It looks sort of like that with some yeah. And okay, and it then tells you you fly along the 110, I think it's 110 degree east meridian for a certain distance, and then you turn to this grid track. And who cares? It's not. That's not how you navigate. Okay. So just remember the answer. So these are just examples. My point here is that there will always be questions that you should just learn the answer. Yeah. Actually, Neil's brought something up. commenting and challenging the question. I should have said this during the exam. If you feel a question is wrong, either doesn't have the right answer, is outside the syllabus, or, which still does happen, or just is incomprehensible, which occasionally still happens too, challenge and comment on the question, because there have been questions that have been cancelled, and you get they don't zero out the question and remove it from the question. They actually give you the mark for the question. So actually, that's that if you can get one cancelled, that's a guaranteed mark. So that actually up to percentage. So yeah, I know in the UK CAA you have 5 minutes at the end of the exam to do that. That's all you're allowed to do, or you're able to do. Yeah, definitely, if you come across a question that you think is wrong, in one of those 3 ways, either the right answer isn't there. Oh no, I suppose 4 ways. The right answer isn't there. There are 2 right answers there. It's outside the syllabus, outside the learning objectives, or it's incomprehensible. You can't understand it. Then yeah, query the question. So yeah, so more than one. Bradley's asking about the 1 to 5 and 3000. That's out of date now, because that's the old ED6. You should use the line. You should use the chart scale itself, not the ruler. What you can do is you can use the ruler and then compare it to the chart scale and mark off. You shouldn't have that problem now. That's the ED4 isn't the wrong scale, from what I remember. The old ED6 is, so you should be all right there. Now, 2 right answers, yeah. I would still complain about them. I know the CAA says choose the more right answer, or if all 4 of them are wrong, choose the least wrong answer. There's the infamous radio nav question where all 4 answers are correct technically, but I know they want the maximum unambiguous range, and therefore that is the answer you give, is pulse repetition and frequency is the answer, and the wrong answers are, I think, frequency, wavelength, and pulse length. But actually, all 3 of those are correct. It's to do with the maximum, which of them determines the maximum range of a radar. Well, all 4 of them can have an effect on the maximum range of a radar, but they're looking for maximum unambiguous range. So you have to, so you put pulse repetition and frequency as the answer. I would say try and answer it. Try and find what you think is the most right answer of the 2, if there are 2 are right, or the least wrong answer if none of them are right. None of them are quite right, and then still complain about it. I hate those. New questions, that should be happening less and less, because they are checked much better. Final segue, actually, excellent, because we are ready now to segue into how the questions are written. Now, okay, how the questions are written. The basic structure is, when I'm asked to write a question, I'm given a learning objective. I write a question with the correct answer as A, and then 3 distractors as B, C, and D. D is always the least likely, so there's often one that's very unlikely. That's why you often find that the one that's easy to eliminate, because most of the time the reviewers don't really care if D is pretty unlikely. It does depend somewhat on the reviewers, but one of the hardest things about writing questions can be writing the distractors, the wrong answers. So writing good distractors can actually be the hardest part of writing the question. So sometimes D is a throwaway. The reason they did that is because they were thinking of removing one of the answers and doing just 3-way multi-choice. And so the answers always put D as the least likely, so they just cancel all the Ds. I don't think they're going to do that now, but don't quote me on it. Okay, so we do that 3 distractors. Then we find a reference. We have to use a reference. That can be very difficult as well. So it will be somewhere, and mostly we use notes, to be honest. I certainly mostly use the notes I've got. I've got CAPT's notes, Oxford's notes, and some of Bristol's notes, and I use those, or online materials. So there's always a reference. which when you come up with a query of the question, that's how they work out that, and an explanation is how they work out whether the question is right or wrong. So then we write an explanation for the right answer, an explanation for not only why the 3 distractors are wrong, but if it's a calculation, we're expected to show a calculation. Now, this is important to you guys. We're expected to show a calculation where the student might make an error, the candidate makes a certain error, and that's how we get that distractor. So you will find that in a lot of cases, the numerical answers, the distractors, the wrong answers, are either one step in your process. If you haven't quite finished the calculation yet, yeah, then you get the distractor. So you might find halfway through your calculation, you get one of the wrong answers. You've probably seen that before. It's if you make a silly error, or if you do an extra calculation that needn't be done. So if I'm asking, if I give you a relative bearing and ask you for the true bearing to the NDB, for example, one of the wrong answers will be the true bearing from the NDB to the aircraft, which is the reciprocal, because there are other questions where they ask you for the bearing to the aircraft, so you might accidentally do the reciprocal when you don't need to. So so do watch out for those, and they can be quite confidence inspiring, because you get halfway through the question and you know you've not finished it yet, but actually you can see the answer there and you can think, yes, this is what the person who wrote the question did. This is how far they got when they wrote that distractor. They said, right, if the student forgets to do that final calculation, that reciprocal, maybe you do need to do the reciprocal. Student forgets to do the reciprocal, this is the answer I get. Right, great, I've got an answer which I know isn't right, because I know I need the reciprocal, but the answer is there as a wrong answer. Yeah, that's really nice. Yeah, which is, in fact, that's the thing I think we're going to miss most about having typing questions, is that you don't have that confidence of little stages coming up as wrong answers. But then I suppose you don't have the answer to fool you, because people do get fooled by that. So yeah, so we're supposed to do that for the distractors, and we have to explain what the student's thought process might be like to get that distractor. Yeah, unless it's something. If it's something fairly obvious and factual, then we don't. Then we just have to say why it's wrong. But if it's something that's numerical, or it's a more obscure factual one, you might say, well, if the student makes this error of thought, then you get that wrong answer. So a lot of the answers. That's why, right? That leads to 2 things. That leads to why some of the wrong answers are. You can see the logic behind them, the mistaken logic behind them. But also on the numerical side, that's the reason for a lot of red herrings. Okay, so this is question writing. Okay, so every time I've got a student whose first language is not English, I have to explain the term red herring. So if your first language is not English, in England, the term red herring is a piece of information that isn't needed and is included deliberately to distract you. And if you use that piece of information, you will get the answer wrong. Yes. And so you must have seen this questions in maths and balance as a classic, where you might get 5 numbers and only need to use 3 of them. Or I've seen ones where you get 5 numbers and literally only need to use 2 of them. So eliminating red herrings. That's why certain techniques for things like the diamond of stuff I use for working out masses, declared masses like takeoff masses and zero fuel mass and so on. That's why they're so useful, is because they actually eliminate red herrings. Yeah, it's very obvious where the red herrings are if you use the right techniques. But do be aware that you might not need to use all the information. Now, again, depending on the time you've got, I've had students who would literally write down every piece of information they've got, and when they use it or decide not to use it, then they cross the information out. And so you'd be looking through that and say, actually, that must be a red herring. Therefore, I'm not going to use it. Therefore, I'm going to cross out that piece of information. The other classic is on performance, but it also comes into things like flight planning. If you're using a graph, they'll give you information that's written on the top of the graph and is actually one of the conditions for the graph. So I was working the other day on some performance, and what was it? Was maximum takeoff power. Well, the whole graph is maximum takeoff power, and flaps to takeoff. Well, that whole graph is flaps to takeoff, yeah, or flaps up. Well, that whole graph is flaps up. You don't need to use that information. It's a red herring, yeah, okay. But there might be numbers as well. So be aware of that, and that comes in because, or some of that comes in because they want you to, they want to be able to predict a mistake, and it makes it much easier. With red herrings, it's easier for us to write the wrong answer, the 3 distractors, if we put it in red herrings. Some subjects, they're a bit more strict about that, and you'll find them more, therefore, flight planning, the person who deals with flight planning is much, much more strict on us when we're doing a calculation, having all 3 answers with a good calculation with an error. You're allowed to use 2 errors. You know, sometimes B is error A, sorry, B is error X, C is error Y, and then D is if you make both X and Y error. So sometimes you get that. But yeah, if it's a particular issue in flight planning, that's why that's one of the reasons there's a lot of distractors. There's a lot of red herrings in flight planning, but other subjects as well. So it does vary slightly subject to subject. Typing questions. So obviously some of you aren't going to be doing typing questions, but for those that are, there is a range. Okay, so, and the range will account for, range. So for example, if your answer was 23.4, the remaining range I might put in might be 23 to 24, and that's how I write it in the little box they have. And then if it's a typing question, anything from 23 to 24 would be an acceptable answer. Yeah. Now, what will we account for when we're considering the range? The first thing is rounding at all stages. Yeah. So rounding, if you've got a multi-stage calculation, I will account for the rounding, and I will be generous. So for something like 23.6, I will say, well, actually, either 23 or 20, actually, so 100. I'll tend to go to rounding for 3 significant figures, depending on the exact question. But let's say I want you to round off no more than, so say this is kilograms, for example. I would want you to round off to no more than 1 kilo. But 1 kilo rounding is absolutely fine. Yeah. But here, I don't care if you round to 123 or 124. Yeah, okay, we know you should round to 124, but we know plenty of people round to 123, and I don't care. It doesn't matter. You know, in the grand scheme of things, if you're worrying about 600 grams, then you're going to crash, because that's not how we do aviation. We do aviation by, you know, having plenty of margin for error. So if 600 grams is a worry to you, then you're trying to do safety by precision. In aviation, safety by precision doesn't work. It causes crashes. Yeah, we do safety by multiple layers of protection. Yeah, not by trying to get everything exactly precise. Okay, so I take into account rounding at all stages. Graph use, interpolation, and again, so if you're interpolating, I would generally give you a range that would allow you for approximations in your interpolation and some slight errors of interpolation. That basically any of these things would slightly increase the range I'm going to give you available. Now, aviation exam, I know they are doing typing questions at the moment, and from what I've seen, at least on some questions, they've got far too tight a range, or maybe no range at all. Because as a student, probably one of you guys, but was asking me yesterday about whether to use 0.514 or 0.5144 for knots to meters per second conversion, and the student had used this, and that's the exams are wrong because they'd use that for their answer. To be honest, I'd have used that if I'd asked the question anyway, but I'd have made sure that this was also within the range. But to be honest, even if I'd used this 0.5144, I'd have made sure 0.514 or 0.515 was suitable, to be honest. who cares? That's not what the question is about. The question is not about how precisely you can work out this stupid radius, because you're in an aeroplane. You don't fly that precisely. It's not. That's 4 significant figures. Who cares? Okay, yeah. So Jordan's mentioning, yeah, 1 knot apart. Yeah. Now, technically, it probably is just about possible to use the CRP5 to 1 knot. Those sorts of questions should be going out, and in fact the ranges are pushing those sorts of questions out, because now any new questions being written, the person writing the question is now thinking about the range of answers. And I've certainly found myself doing 4 multi-choice answers, so I've done the right answer and the 3 distractors, and then I've come to the range for the typing version of the question, and I've looked, well, I've got to do the range like this. Well, actually, that means one extent of the range is closer to one of the distractors than it is to the correct answer. So actually, my range is making the question easier than the multi-choice. So my thought then is that actually I have to move my multi-choice answers. And so certainly from my point of view, I try and be fair on the multi-choice as well. And I would never have done them 1 knot apart. 2 knots maybe. So you've got 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 3 knots. I would have done that as 230, 232, and 234. That's fine. I think 2 knots is fine. But if you look at the damn scale, only goes to 2 knots. And yes, you can read it to 1 knot. I'm not saying you can't, but this instrument really isn't suitable for working out to 1 knot. I'm presuming you mean wind velocities, yeah. So object appeal. People have. I don't think you'll get the appeal. Just do the best you can. Okay, actually, in a minute. An aside. Right. Let's say. So we're not talking about question writing at the moment. So I'm going to blank that out. Let's say, for example, that you have a question that the answers given are 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 2, and 2, 3, 3. Actually, no, I'm not going to do that, because I'd say that. Let's do the fair question. Okay. What happens then if I get an answer that is 2, 3, 3? That's the answer I've just found from my CRP5, and that's perfectly possible. Okay. Which is why I'd be reluctant even to do this 2 knots apart. But, okay. What do I do then? What I would say you don't do is try and redo the entire question more accurately. What I would do is go back over how you did the question, and shuffle things around, check things, and see what direction any errors were, because you'll almost certainly find that there were 2 or more tiny errors in the same direction. Yeah. So let's say those. Your wind mark isn't exactly correct, and your center bug wasn't quite on the right position, and in both of those were slightly reducing the speed that you came out with. Then you know that the answer must be 2, 3, 4. If both my errors were slightly reducing the speed, well, actually what's happened then is my correct answer is 2, 3, 4, but those 2 errors have brought the speed down to 2, 3, 3. So direction of errors is the best way of working out if you're halfway or halfway, roughly halfway in between 2 answers on a multi-choice. Then go and work out which direction your errors were in. And I wouldn't try and correct the errors, because you'll just make more. It's so the reason you made the errors in the first place is it's very difficult to do these things without sort of half knot errors here and there. Yeah. So I mean, particularly things like wind direction. Wind direction is the worst one, in fact, because it's the shortest vector, so it's very, very sensitive to slight changes in position of the wind mark you make. So I would say it's impossible to do a wind direction to the nearest degree. So go back and see which direction your errors were. Don't try and do it again more precisely, because you'll make errors that are probably just as big, or you'll take so much time over it and keep rubbing out and redrawing your marks that you've wasted time. Go back and work out which direction the errors were in. Does everyone understand what I mean by which? Does anyone not understand what I mean by which direction the errors were in? Excellent, good. Well, do I have any more notes? Okay, so yeah, so that's the range. Oh, by the way, so I've talked about how I write the range. I must say, oh no, interpolation. Okay, yeah. So I should say, see, that's the other thing I was going to say. CRP5 and errors in the CRP5. Is it CX? What's the electronic one? CX3? Is it? Anyway, whatever it is, the electronic flight computer. Now, what I tend to do is I don't have a CX3, but I have a spreadsheet. I'll put that up on the Facebook page as well, because that does randomized questions on these things. I've got a spreadsheet that does it mathematically using trigonometry, and so I get precise answers. But I will always, I know you use a CRP5, so I will always increase the range because of CRP5 use. Obviously, you might have more than one of these, but if you're using the CRP5, if you need to use the CRP5 for it, I will expand the range for that. Okay, so that really, and then the final thing is, I've only ever been asked to increase the range I've been given, and twice I've been told that the range wasn't correct, and both times I was asked to increase the range, and I feel my ranges were fair. And in at least one of the cases, I don't think it really needed increasing, but that's fine. I don't mind. More fair on the student, it's easier on the student. So I think the ranges are fair. I think they're using fair ranges. So don't be worried about type-ins being harder than multi-choice, because I think actually with the ranges they're using, it's probably as easy, if not slightly easier. Okay. So that's the range. Final thing, just a quick word about how we're asked to write the questions. One thing someone's mentioned is longest answer. No, we are asked specifically to try not to make the longest answer. It's not banned, but we are asked specifically try not to make the answers too different in length. Yeah, and there are circumstances where they'll perfectly happily accept it. There's there might be a question where one of the answers is it doesn't change, or increases by 1, decreases by 1, doesn't change, and then of course doesn't change is going to be longer, and that's a perfectly acceptable answer. So if it's equivalent as an answer, even though it's longer, just because of the way that it's worded, just because the word's needed, then it's fine. It's when the answer has a lot of explanation in, and this is deliberate, because you're right, some of the old questions, the longest answer, because of the explanation needed to be precise on a correct answer, the longest answer was the right answer. But now we're told not to do that if we can help it, and to try and make the answers equivalent. Yeah, as I say, it's not banned. So I'm not saying that you should always discard the longest answer. The point is that now the longest answer shouldn't give you any information. Yeah, the fact that it's the longest answer shouldn't tell you whether it's right or wrong. It's you've got to, hopefully there's a 1 in 4 chance of the longest answer being the right. Yeah, that's what they're aiming for, specifically. As for multi-answer questions, none of the above shouldn't be in there. Now I know it comes into some of the exam ones, the database ones, but we've been now. I think you'll probably find that you rarely have multi-answer questions. Where these ones where you have a list 1, 2, 3, and 4, and you have to, or 5, 6, even, or 8, and decide which of them are right and wrong. I would say in general nowadays you rarely, if ever, get them all right or all wrong. Yeah, but I can't say that. That's as far as I know, that's not official policy. But then they're not supposed to say none of above. In fact, I don't think they'll ever do all wrong. And I can't. Again, I'm not saying that is an official policy, but as someone who writes questions, it's just not a thing you write. Yeah. Okay. Final couple of things. 1 to 3 minutes. So each question we allocate 1, 2, or 3 minutes. Yeah. So it should take no longer than 3 minutes. But also, if we think it's going to take a minute and 10 seconds or a minute and 20 seconds for an average student. I roughly say, if I'm not sure what time it's going to take, I go back to the question fresh a week later, try it myself, and half the time it takes, sorry, double the time it takes me. I assume I'll take half the time a student would take. So that's how I roughly do it. But if I assume it's going to take a minute and 20 seconds, I have to put 2 minutes. I can't put 1 minute. It's not long enough. But there is no option for minute 20 seconds. So what you should find is more and more new questions come in, actually the time pressure eases on the subjects, particularly like Gen Nav and flight planning. The pressure will ease because there are these questions. If normal factual question takes you 20 seconds, yeah, about that for a one-word answer factual question, or even a 2-3 word answer factual question, it takes about 20 seconds. I've got to give you a minute for that. So that gives you 40 seconds to use on another question. So there should be better timing, a lot better timing now on newer questions. And the final thing is scenarios. So you might have noticed a scenario question is one where you discuss what's happening with the aeroplane, and or a brief scenario. It can be as brief as the aircraft is on approach to leave Bradford Airport. Yeah, and then you know it asks you the question around that. They are asking us to do more of those in general. They're asking us specifically to do that on some questions. Now, I like scenario questions because I can explain something better there than I could with an abstract question. So I can put some detail there that's easier for you to understand, easier for me to present the question clearly. So I often write them even when I'm not asked for a scenario question. They never mind us writing a scenario question. It's just some questions that they ask us to write scenarios. There's a problem though. There are questions where we're asked to write scenario questions which I don't think are at all suitable. I've only ever had it twice, I think. I don't think are at all suitable scenario questions. So don't be distracted if you get a question which has a scenario and it seems completely pointless. But the scenario is irrelevant. Some question writers have been asked to do a scenario question, looked at it and thought, what? Last year it happened to me, and I literally wrote on a comment, because you can write comments. You can write comments backwards and forwards. So write on a comment, look, I don't really think this is suitable for a scenario. I think it would be a better question. That one I thought it would be a better question if it didn't have a scenario. But here's a question with the scenario, and they accepted it. So you will get scenario, but just try and ignore the scenario if it doesn't fit. It probably doesn't matter. But scenario questions, for the most part, are there to make it easier to understand. So I know some students complain about wordy scenario questions, but actually you should hopefully find it makes it easier to understand. Particularly, I mean, you guys are all modular, I presume. So you've all actually flown. So even if we're talking about jet aircraft, there's some familiarity at least. So the scenario is there to help you in general. So for the most part, use it. Yeah, keep that in your imagination and think of reality. It tends to ground the person writing the question as well. I mean, I try and always write realistic questions, but we all know there's questions out there where there's a mass and balance question where there's moving mass and you move about 1/3 of the mass of the aircraft. I think it works out as 30% of the mass of the aircraft gets moved, which is ridiculous. And there's other questions where you're in a 737-400 and you're climbing to 35,000 feet, cruising altitude 31,000 feet or whatever it is, at 70 tons or 65 tons, which is above the maximum takeoff mass of the aircraft. I don't like that sort of question. And yeah, I know that the graph goes up there and there's no fundamental reason why you can't answer the question, but yeah, there's no reason not to ask a question that's possible and legal on that aircraft. But anyway, the scenarios tend to sort of ground us and make us write a question that seems like a real question. And I think that's easier for the student to understand. I certainly find it easier to understand when I come across those questions. So, but there are occasional questions where the scenario isn't really appropriate. Just ignore it as best you can. It is going to be there very occasionally. You'll probably find 1 or 2 in the whole time you go through all the exams where you don't really need the scenario. Okay, and that's about it, I think. unless anyone's got more questions. Oh, what should you write in an appeal? Okay, so in an appeal, I would just say, obviously, question number, and as brief as a brief explanation. I would first say why you think it's not a good question, i.e. not in the LOs, no right answer, more than one right answer, or incomprehensible. And then, if possible, write more detail. So if it's more than one right answer, write out mention which answers you think are correct. If it's no right answers, I would say mention the answer you've chosen and say why you think it's wrong. Or maybe if there's two answers that were possibly the least wrong, you know, usually you'll find, as I say, eliminating two answers is usually fine. I mentioned D, so usually it's very frequently one that's really off the wall, but often eliminating two answers is fine. So brief explanation on the other two, say there are two answers which you think are close, but you think are still wrong. Brief explanation of why you think they're wrong. And you just say, look, I think these are, you know, A and B are closest, but A is wrong because X, B is wrong because X, if you can do that. But at the very least, put the question number and the basic explanation of, you know, no right answers, more than one right answer, etc., because they'll be looked at relatively carefully. In that case, I don't actually know who reviews them. Oh, ELO 1A, yeah, okay, so I think that's everything we need on the recording. I'll just stop recording.